Our phone number, 1-800-468-MIKE, 1-800-468-6453. I think I told you about my cab ride home last night. I think this cab ride home, and as I said, once you get in the cab, they start talking, and they don't shut up until you pay them. And this cab driver's telling me how much he loves my next guest. Hates Margaret Thatcher, hates Tony Blair, loves the next guest on the show. I didn't have the guts to tell him who my father was because I wanted to stay in the cab. I didn't want to get thrown asunder. My guest on the show, George Galloway. George Galloway, you might remember, was in the United States here, about a year ago. There was all kinds of talk. He went before a Senate committee. He was accused of, along with the former, French Minister Charles Pasqua, of receiving the right to buy oil under the UN's oil for food scheme that was going on. Well, he had some things to say about that. Upon his arrival, he told Reuters, I have no expectation of justice from a group of Christian fundamentalists and Zionist activists under the chairmanship of a neocon, George Bush. And so that's the way things were there in Washington, D.C. Well, here's a man who calls for Blair to go. He said it's time to go. And he joins me on the hotline to talk about, I guess, what's going on here in Britain, about the war, and about Tony Blair going. George Galloway, thank you for being on the show.
No, it's a great pleasure.
It's good to have you. You're a fiery man. You were in Washington, D.C. You were not taking any, you weren't taking any prisoners, were you?
Well, Senator Norman Coleman began the day of those hearings as a presidential hopeful, but he didn't end them that way. And you could measure that by the length of his face at the end of the proceedings. I knew that I'd won when I got outside the chamber and a black janitor came up to me and high-fived me and said, way to go, man. You sent Bush back to his ranch. So I knew that I'd made a hit, at least with one section of American public opinion. And then when I got back, Michael, I had over 25,000 emails from the United States. So altogether, it was a good day out on the Hill. And then I went back last year at this time on a speaking tour. I did 10 cities in 12 days, packed theaters everywhere, and I now discover that there's a website in the United States which is selling my extracts from my speeches embroidered on boxer shorts and thongs and hoodies. So I seem to have some kind of public in the United States, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, you're grateful for that. Norman Coleman, by the way, was not going to run for president of the United States. Norm Coleman does a job there in his position, but I don't think he'd ever want to be president of the United States. Listen, you made your opposition known. Your disdain, of course, for the war in Iraq and the Bush and the Blair administrations and their involvement in it. You are opposed to the war on terror, are you not? Or are you just opposed to what's going on in Iraq? And do you separate them?
I'm opposed to terrorism, whether it's carried out by men in suits in Whitehall or the White House, or men in turbans with beards in the Tora Bora. I'm against terrorism, root and branch. Indeed, I was opposed to Osama bin Laden when Britain and the United States were giving him guns and money and sending him to Afghanistan in the first place. What I say is that the current war on terror, as waged by these donkeys who are in charge of it, is actually making more terror, is manufacturing thousands of new bin Ladens every other day by the blunders that they are making. They are watering the swamp of hatred out of which this phenomenon arises with new toxicity every day.
You say that, but yet there were bombings prior to the Iraq War in the United States. There was the First World Trade Center situation. There were embassies that were blown up prior to that. We had another ship, the Cole, that was taken out. These people have been terrorizing us or at war with us for a long period of time. We are now involved in it. So you're saying that we're manufacturing bin Ladens, but the fact is that they've been at war with us prior to 9/11, prior to us going into Iraq. Is that not true?
No, it's not, and it's the standard neocon falsification. In fact,
no, don't go by a neocon falsification. I mean, I'm just asking you a question.
Well, let me answer. The parting of the ways between bin Laden and his former paymasters in the United States began with the first Iraq War in 1991. which was prior to all those bombings that you referred to, the Cole, the U.S. embassies, and the rest, and arose out of the presence of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in Saudi Arabia for the war on Iraq in 1991. And then the sanctions, which killed 1 million Iraqi children, rolled out thereafter. And this phenomenon of Islamist fundamentalist fanatic terrorism grew like topsy during all of that period. So it doesn't predate it at all. Now, if you want a sensible policy to drain the swamp of hatred out of which these monsters are coming, then you have to look at the Western policy towards the Israel-Palestine dispute. You have to look at the situation in Iraq, and you have to stop propping up the puppet presidents and corrupt kings that rule the Muslim world almost without exception from one end to the other, who wouldn't be in power for 5 more minutes if it were not for the political, military, diplomatic, in some cases financial support of your government and mine.
You talk about a million Iraqi children dying because of sanctions on Iraq, but you and I both know, and we found this out through the Oil for Food program, there was a lot of money. By the way, it did not include medical situations or food into Iraq. There was plenty of money that was going into Iraq, and you had Saddam Hussein building palaces in Iraq instead of feeding his own people and taking care of his own people. That wasn't the United States of America or sanctions that killed 1 million people. That was Saddam Hussein, was it not?
Well, that's not true either, and it's important to know the history of this. There were total sanctions on Iraq from 1990. The Oil for Food program didn't start until 1996. And in those 6 years, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children became first malnourished, then stunted, then dead. And the backlog, the attrition of that 6 years was never made up for by the Oil for Food program, which accounted for 30 cents per day per Iraqi. Now, there were sales of oil during the period 1996 until 2003 when the war began, but 35%, more than 1/3 of the takings were immediately confiscated by the United Nations to pay for compensation to cash-strapped Kuwait and billionaire businessmen and multinational companies who claimed that they'd lost money because of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990. So when you tally it all up, it's 30 cents per day per Iraqi for a small period of the time that Iraq was under sanctions. Now, nobody serious is denying that 1 million children died. Now, the fact that they had a brutal dictator as a president was not their fault. In fact, it was much more our fault than it was their fault, because we put that brute in power in the first place, and we gave him all the weapons and the wherewithal to repress his people and attack others, to attack Iran, to suppress the Kurds and others in the inside Iraq. All of this was done whilst Saddam Hussein was best buddies with your government and mine.
And because we're also fighting a Cold War, we also, at that point in time, Iran had taken Americans hostage, and so we had to choose which one was going to be our friend in a situation where both were really our enemies, which we have done all through history, whether it's Marcos or you name it, going through the system. You can say the same thing about Fidel Castro or any one of those despotic leaders during the Cold War. We had to choose sides sometimes, and sometimes you chose the best of the bad guys to be your friend. Am I right?
Well, I mean,
we had to do that for the Cold War.
If you can shamelessly recite that mantra, I feel sorry for you, because one day.
But it's true. But it's absolutely true.
I don't think that will quite pass muster, that you supported one monster because he was against another.
But did we?
Monster
But didn't? But both sides did.
Well,
but both sides. But it's, George. Yes.
Michael, we just have a different concept here. I don't believe in the concept of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And if you look at bin Laden, you shouldn't either. You see, you supported bin Laden because he was the enemy of your enemy. You made him your friend. And look what he did. Look what he became. You can't have a tiger by the tail. That's why it's a tiger. If you could have it by the tail, it wouldn't be a tiger.
So where do you stand when it comes to, like, the the former Soviet Union that during the Cold War was supportive of, Yasser Arafat, the Palestinians.
Well, if they were, insofar as they were in support of Yasser Arafat
Well, they
and
were.
the Palestinians, well, insofar as they were doing the right thing. And if you hadn't been so wholly and totally in support of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians, the destruction of Palestine, the wiping of Palestine off the map, the dispersal of millions of Palestinians to the four corners of the globe, including your own country, as refugees, then you wouldn't have so many Muslims hating you today, so much that they're ready to trade their lives for many of yours.
But, George, if they're refugees from Jordan, are they not? Because that's where they were living, and they were thrown out of Jordan into Lebanon, not by America, but by King Hussein of Jordan.
No, Michael. The Palestinians were driven out by Israel in 1948 and then again in 1967. Why don't you ask some of the very large number of Palestinians in America, fine Americans, to give you some education on this? Don't blame King Hussein of Jordan. Don't blame other people. It's Israel that wiped Palestine off the map. That's why it no longer exists. Go to the Atlas and look for Palestine. You won't find it. It's been wiped off the map. And the Palestinians today...
Well, then, if you want to go talk it, but George, if you want to go back and talk about maps, Palestine originally, was it not Israel?
No.
I mean, Israelis were originally Palestinians.
No. If you're talking about going back 2,000 years, then you'll have to give your country back to the Comanche and the Cherokee. And if you want to go back 2,000 years, the Iranians will be in Greece and the Greeks will be in Turkey and so on. That's a preposterous argument. The Palestinians who are still alive today have houses from which they were driven and in which now Jewish people from Brooklyn or London or Vienna or Paris are now living, whilst those Palestinians whose houses they are living in refugee camps. It's the fact that you can't get your head around that or your heart to accept it that is the core reason for the hatred of the United States in the Muslim world. Now, have it your own way. If you want to have billions of people hating you around the world, then don't come crying when some of them try to hurt you back. But if you want to solve this problem, if you want to drain this swamp of hatred, then listen to what I'm saying to you.
Well, but you've got the problem here in Britain where you have now homegrown terrorists killing your own people. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's the same problem. They're coming out of the same swamp of hatred because of the role our country is playing in this Monica Lewinsky-like relationship with George W. Bush. Our country is in the front ranks of the hated in the world, and this poison has now spread into our own country. They're always looking for a reason why young Muslim men are being radicalized in Britain. They're always looking for a cleric or an organization to blame. But the only thing that a young Muslim in Britain needs to get radicalized is a television set. He only has to switch on the news, and hey presto, he's radicalized, because he sees the suffering of the people in Palestine and elsewhere, and you know what? He gets radicalized.
But you could turn on the same TV and see what their brothers and sisters are doing in the Middle East by blowing themselves up and killing innocent men and women, in many cases, killing people of their own kind, not killing Jews, but killing people of their own kind.
But until Bush and Blair invaded Iraq, there was never a suicide bomb in the entire history of Iraq. Suicide bombing and the other phenomenon that you're talking about occurred because of the invasion and occupation of Iraq.
So you're saying if we left Iraq, if we just pulled out of Iraq, we'd all be, what, living happily ever after?
Well, look, I'll answer that point, but you should have a little humility, because you're now telling me you have to stay in Iraq because of the consequences.
Well, no, what I'm asking you, George, what I'm asking you is if we pull out...
I'm going to answer that point. That have a little humility. Your country and mine committed a gigantic crime, which was worse than a crime. It was a blunder, which has set the whole world on fire. And now you're asking me to agree to you staying there because of the fact that you did it in the first place.
All right,
now,
so George...
Let me tell you. The Iraqis are in no need of a genius from Crawford, Texas, to tell them how to rebuild their country. Iraq is an ancient civilization much older than yours and much older than mine. Just leave the Iraqis to get on with their own lives. Let them rebuild their own country. They're not asking for anything from you except the sight of the backs of your heads leaving their country. And you know what? If you don't leave, they're going to kill more and more of your soldiers who are young men, poor men, black men, Hispanic men. There are no sons of senators there. There are no sons of bigwigs in the United States there. Just
That's not true.
People who are conscripted by poverty in the United States of America.
George, that's not true. George, you need to study some things too. That's not true. There are people there serving in Iraq, in our military, who are the sons and daughters of people who are members of Congress, members of, many different factions in the United States of America. They're not all poor.
Name me one senator with a son fighting in Iraq.
I'll name you one congressman, Duncan Hunter, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, whose son's fighting in Iraq, has done 2 tours there.
All right. There's 140,000 people in your armed forces in Iraq. 99% of them are blacks, Hispanics, or poor whites, just like in Vietnam. When George Bush and Dick Cheney were dodging the draft, they were sending the poor into the maw of Vietnam to die or to kill for rich men. They died for nothing in Vietnam, and the young men are dying for nothing in Iraq.
George, you really sound like you're going off the liberal left talking points here, which we hear in the United States of America on a regular basis. Listen, we've got to take a break. Can you stay with me?
For another few minutes, just, yes.
Okay, let me take a break. We'll come on back. More with George Galloway on the Mike Reagan Talk Show right after this. Mike Reagan here. Are you concerned about the uncertainty in the stock market caused by the looming threat of terrorism, the rising cost of oil, and the potential crisis with Iran? How about rising interest rates? If so, you're not alone, and the time to act is now. As my good friend Jonathan Rose, president of Capital Gold, has been saying on my radio show for months, investing in gold is a great way to round out your portfolio and to help protect your assets against volatility in the stock market. Call Capital Gold at 800-510-9594 today to learn how to invest in gold with their free gold investment guide. Gold is not only a safe long-term investment, some forms of it have outperformed the Dow Jones over the past 30 years, and gold has proven repeatedly that it maintains purchasing power. Call 800-510-9594, and you can also learn how to transfer 401ks and IRAs into a gold or silver-backed IRA. Call 800-510-9594 or go to safeasgold.com.
Please stay tuned to the following public announcement. The government and private banks are liquidating houses now. These houses have been foreclosed, confiscated, or repossessed and will be sold. Homes may be sold for little or no money down. For a list of foreclosures, call 800-338-1351. All listeners whose last name begins with the letter A through N are allowed to start calling now. Listeners whose last name begins with O through Z can begin calling tomorrow, 9 a.m. Every house must be sold. There's currently a large inventory of homes and properties available. Homes may be sold for little or no money down. I repeat, this is a public announcement. All listeners whose last name begins with the letter A through N can start calling now. Listeners whose last name begins with O through Z can begin calling tomorrow, 9 a.m. Call CRN's national toll-free hotline for your foreclosure list at 800-338-1351. That's 800-338-1351.
Radio has never sounded so red, white, and blue.
You do it better than anybody.
We stay up every night listening to this station.
This is Radio America.
We're here today with Paul Dow of Timeshares Only. And, Paul, you've got some terrific news for timeshare owners.
That's right. In the next 6 months, over $3.5 billion of timeshares will be sold.
So this is the perfect time to sell.
Exactly, which is why you need to get your property into our network. And if you call us right now, you'll also get a $500 shopping spree absolutely free.
$500 free?
Yes, just for posting your property with Timeshares Only. And when you do sell your property, you'll get cash. It's a double bonus you can't lose.
Except if I don't call.
Hey, over 10 million people will be looking to buy a timeshare. So we need your property now.
The number to call now is 1-800-921-0714. That's 1-800-921-0714. Turn your timeshare into cash and get a free $500 shopping spree.
And if our lines are busy, please keep calling.
That number again for timeshares only is 1-800-921-0714. That's 1-800-921-0714.
This is Dan Hall from No More Waiting, the folks that get structured settlement holders their money now. So right now, call us at 800-462-1790. Got an insurance settlement that's taking years to pay out, but you want your money now? No More Waiting is for you. You're in the third year of a 20-year settlement, but you want a new car or a new home now. No More Waiting is for you. Need to catch up on bills now? No More Waiting is for you. Call 800-462-1790. Want answers about your settlement payments now? No More Waiting is for you. In fact, No More Waiting has prepared a DVD chock full of information to help you get the most money for your settlement payments. Call today. It's free and there's no obligation. Call 800-462-1790. That's right. For your free DVD, just call 800-462-1790. For your free quote, your free DVD, and your path to financial freedom, call No More Waiting at 800-462-1790 now.
This show is sponsored in part by the Renai Corporation. This is the Michael Reagan Show.
We're back, everybody. Michael Reagan here. 1-800-468-MIKE is the phone number live in London, England. Talking to George Galloway. He is on the hotline. Mr. Galloway, I appreciate you taking the time to spend with me. We only have about 2 minutes left. Where does your government go from here? You've called for Tony Blair to step down. It looks like he's going to be stepping down earlier rather than later. What's your government going to do with new leadership?
I think he'll be gone by Christmas, and it's a remarkable thing because the British economy is doing quite well, and society is better than it was when Mr. Blair took over 10 years ago. And prime ministers don't normally fall in those circumstances. He's falling, I predict to you, before Christmas because of his foreign policy. And we have to change that foreign policy. And the primary plank of that foreign policy is unending and total obeisance to the policy of George Bush in the White House. The new prime minister, if he doesn't want to go the same way as Tony Blair, is going to have to change Britain's foreign policy. So watch out for that on your side of the Atlantic.
Do you think they will change that foreign policy? And do you think with a change of foreign policy, you're going to pull your military out of Iraq?
I'm absolutely sure about that. You know, not because Mr. Brown wants to. Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown are two cheeks of the same backside. But Mr. Blair will have fallen because of the war and because of his relationship with Bush. And Mr. Brown knows that if he's to avoid going the same way, he'll have to change.
So you're telling Mr. Brown that he needs to change, he needs to pull the military out of Iraq. Do you think with that happening, if they were to pull the Brits out of Iraq, where would that leave the United States? Do you think we'd have to pull out too?
Yes, and I think more and more people in the United States want that to happen. A clear majority in the opinion.
Do you think that would empower? Would that empower? Go ahead.
And would that give what?
Would that empower the terrorists, or would they, as you said, as they see the backs of our heads go out, that they would stop the incursions, they would stop the bombings?
Well, it's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. In other words, things will never change as long as the occupation is going on. How much damage we've done to Iraq, how much poison we've injected into it, and the sectarian poison is the most toxic, of course, we'll have to see. But the one thing that's sure is that this war will get worse and spread as long as the countries that invaded Iraq remain there.
George Galloway, thank you for spending time on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
I appreciate it. I'm Mike Reagan. He's George Galloway. You've heard his opinion. Our phone number, 1-800-468-MIKE. We webcast this show, podcast this show every day. Thank you for listening.